Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Peter did an excellent job introducing me, but I always feel, I always like to introduce myself as well. Not now, gosh, dates. Hi, I'm Lea. Here's a fun fact you might not know about me. I actually grew up in Greece, and specifically in the island of Lesbos, which technically makes me geographically lesbian, probably the first you've ever seen. Seriously, that's my island's claim to fame, the word lesbian. It literally means someone from Lesbos. So if you've heard my name before, it might be due to my open source work, or maybe my standards work, or my book. If you have it, I can sign it. But I'm not here to talk about any of these. So 3 years ago, I did something crazy, according to some people at least in my environment. I joined academia to do research. And specifically, I joined the Haystack group at MIT. This is the website. And I joined to do research on human-computer interaction, which is kind of the fancy academic term for usability. And the question I've been trying to answer for the last 3 years or so is, how can we make web programming easier? So even though I moved to academia, I'm still working on the web. And you might be wondering, what's actually the problem here? What is this problem that you're trying to solve? But I'm sure many of you, will, especially those that started with web development before you had other programming experience, might be familiar with this. People start by learning HTML and CSS, and they can create stuff. Yes, there's always a learning curve, but it's smoother. They can immediately start creating useful things. And yes, the more CSS they learn, the prettier it becomes, or the more flexible it becomes. But they can immediately put something out there. Whereas when it comes to adding other common things they've seen on websites, like maybe they want to store some data, maybe they want to edit something right on the website, maybe they want to add some interactivity, and suddenly they find themselves bombarded with all these software engineering concepts. And it can be very frustrating. And there are so many tools that keep coming out every day, and they claim to make web development easier, but it still feels like this to learn JavaScript today. It's indicative that there's this website called todomvc.com that compares all the popular JavaScript frameworks. It implements the same to-do list with all of them. And we've counted how many lines of JavaScript. We didn't count HTML or CSS, just JavaScript. And just to make this very simple to-do list, it takes hundreds of lines of JavaScript, even with all these really high abstraction frameworks. I recently came across this quote in a Medium article, and it resonated so much with me. It says, our default workflow has been complicated by the needs of large web applications. These frameworks tend to be designed by developers working on large applications for other developers working on large web applications. And they complicate things even more for the usual developer or designer working on like a small client website or even a hobby project. A few months ago, I posted this poll on Twitter, and I'm not aware of any more scientific data on this, which is why I'm using this data. Yes, it's a Twitter poll, but it does have almost 4,000 votes, so it does show something. So I asked, hey, people who write HTML and CSS, how familiar are you with JavaScript? And only half of the respondents were actually very comfortable with JavaScript. The rest ranged from not much to somewhat. And yet all our tools are designed with the assumption that if you can write HTML and CSS, you can also write JavaScript, which is not quite accurate. It feels to me that the landscape of creating on the web today looks like this. On one hand, we have vanilla JS and frameworks that are thin abstractions on top of JS, which give you all the control you want. You can build anything with them, but also they require a lot of knowledge and a lot of effort. And on the other side, you have prefabricated software that you install on your own server, and you can customize if you know how to do that, and it's built for a specific purpose, like CMSs, forums, Q&A software. There's all these scripts that you install on your server, and they're built for a specific purpose. and they're kind of rigid to customize. And on the far end of the spectrum, we have services like Instagram or Facebook, which host your data. They provide you existing interfaces. You don't have to do anything, but you also can't do anything. You can't customize them in any way. And I feel there's nothing in between. There should be. There's a lot of people that can write some HTML and CSS, but they're not programmers. And the thing is, if you ask these people, you might be wondering, okay, if they want to create, they can always learn programming. But if you actually talked with these people, if you talk with these people, which we did, you'll find that they all have things they want to create. All sorts of custom data needs, like some of them are more common, like creating a portfolio, but others can be very niche, like managing horse feedings. I didn't make that one up. It's a real case. But of course, the only difference, like creativity is a basic human need. Everybody wants to create, everybody has data to manage and share. The only difference is whether they can actually do that. Some of them know programming, and they can do that today, and others can't. And many of you might be thinking, well, I'm a developer, I don't really care. But the thing is, if you make something accessible to novices, it becomes easier for everybody. Think of when we add new HTML features, for example. Think of when we added the range slider to be able to do like sliders natively without having to include scripts or code it ourselves. Everybody uses that now, unless they're worried about browser support. But in terms of usability, it's so much better for everybody, even for people who can actually code a slider from scratch. Why would you do that today? So we started from HTML. There are several reasons for that. We've noticed that even people who are not very technical, they can still learn some HTML. They don't find it as hard as learning to program. And there are some reasons for that. HTML is very forgiving. You don't have the experience of like forgetting a semicolon and it complains. Then you forget a closing parenthesis, it complains again. Like, this is a very frustrating experience when people are trying to learn a traditional programming language. Like, it's hard to keep punctuation as strict as is required by these languages when you're learning. And they keep stumbling on errors. And this can discourage a lot of people. Whereas with HTML, you can screw up as much as you want, and the browser will do something with it. Also, HTML fails gracefully. If you make a mistake, it shows something. It's not like XML, for example, where if you make a mistake, you just see an error message. Or like JavaScript, where if you make a mistake, everything breaks. Like, many other languages are like that. They're very strict. Also, it has a small syntax. And I know some of you might be thinking, what small syntax? There's a ton of tags. But actually, the syntax itself is very small. All you have to learn is angle brackets. They mean an HTML element. How do you declare properties? Like, what's the syntax for, attributes. What's the syntax for that? You use an equal sign for the value. Like, you use quotes, that kind of thing. Like, that's something you can learn in an hour. Actually, less than an hour, probably. And then all you have to do is look up, what HTML element do I need for my case? What attribute do I need? But you know how to proceed. Whereas when what you need to learn is more syntax, you don't even know what to Google for. And we see this a lot in languages that are novice-friendly, like HTML, CSS as well. Like, once you learn the basic syntax, all you have to do is search, what property do I need? What values does it accept? And yes, there are lots and lots of properties. And yes, CSS has become harder than it used to be. But at least you have something to search for. Same with spreadsheets. The syntax itself is very small. It's just functions. Once you know how to call functions, that's it. And all you have to do is search, what function do I need? So we wanted to have something that also has small syntax and large vocabulary. Large vocabulary is fine. It's searchable. And also, HTML is portable. It's just like all web languages, but not every language is portable. For example, Visual Studio languages depend on having Visual Studio installed. Whereas with HTML, it's an open standard. It works on every browser. So actually, what we decided to do is extend HTML itself. Many people already know HTML. Why would they have to learn another language just to create web applications? So we called our language Mavo. And the primitives, the building blocks we based it on were things that we saw people were struggling with. They were trying to do them, and they were having a lot of trouble learning the necessary JavaScript to actually accomplish them, like editing data. collections, like having multiple copies of the same thing with different data. Persistence, storing data somewhere. Like, why is this so hard today? And not just locally on the browser, but also remotely. Uploads, like why is it so hard to make a website for a client and let them upload images right on the website? It should be much easier. Or data flow, like you have some data, you want to transform it, display it in a slightly different way. So before I move on describing what Mavo actually is, I want to make one thing very clear. Mavo is just one answer to the question. It's not necessarily the best. It's the one we've been working on. But the main thing is getting the dialogue going. The main thing is that what's important is the question. And maybe if more people start thinking about the question, if more people try to make web programming easier, eventually we might end up with something that actually solves this problem. Maybe it's Mavo, maybe it's something like Mavo, maybe it's completely different. So you can play with Mavo today. All it takes is include a JavaScript file and a CSS file. But ultimately, our vision is for Mavo to prototype something like how HTML could look in the far future. Like ideally, our ultimate vision is that HTML itself will eventually have features like this. But today, you have to include a JavaScript or CSS and the CSS file to try it. Or you can go to play.mavo.io. So before I start describing the syntax, here's an example of a to-do list. Because the to-do list is like the canonical example of any web application. Like every framework, every language starts by showing you how to create a to-do list, and this is no exception. So this is a to-do list created with Mavo. And try to guess, if you had to guess, how many lines of JavaScript do you think that took to write? Like how many lines did somebody have to write to create a to-do list with Mavo? Not counting HTML and CSS. 0 is the answer. All it took is this kind of HTML and, of course, some CSS to style it. And actually, most of it is part of the template. The highlighted parts are the only parts that are Mavo. So if you're interested, let's describe the syntax a bit. You activate Mavo in a part of your HTML with the MV app attribute. It doesn't do anything by itself. And you specify where your data will be stored with the MV storage attribute. And a very simple value is local, which saves your data locally in the browser, so you can refresh and it's still there. But that's not very interesting. What's more interesting is that if the value of MV storage is a URL to one of our existing services that we support, which can also be extended by third-party developers with plugins very easily. Right now, we support GitHub and Dropbox. So if you give it a GitHub URL in MV storage, it automatically provides you with the necessary login UI, save UI, all that. You can see that in the video over there. And you might be wondering, OK, so you've specified where you want your data to be stored, but what is actually stored? So the answer to that is elements with a property attribute. And depending on the element, Mavo knows how to handle it. So for example, here, if I change this edit field or this slider, first off, notice that there is a save button now, and it got highlighted, which means there's data to save. And if I hover over it, it shows me what has actually changed. And I can click Save to save it. If I reload, notice that the changes persist. And if you don't want to have to click on Save, you can also specify an MV autosave attribute. Now there's no Save button. You don't need to do anything. It's saved automatically. So far we've shown form elements, but these are easier to handle even if you were learning JavaScript. What's more interesting is when you apply the property attribute on elements that are not form elements. So what happens in that case is that they become editable. And notice that there's now an edit button here. By the way, all this UI is completely customizable. This is just the default. And let's look at what happens when you put it on an image. So in this case, uploads are not allowed because it's local, so where would it store them? So you can just change the URL of the image. But if it was GitHub, you would also get UI to uploading your image. Or if you put it on a meter, I can hover over the meter and change the value. On a date, I get a date picker. On a heading, I can just change the the name. I even have a picture for this. Yes. So depending on the type of the element, Mavo knows how to make it editable in different ways. And let's look at a list of hobbies, for example. I've given it a property attribute, so it's editable. I can change it to something else. And I could even add multiple of this and do this, change them. Uh-oh. And now they're all editable. But you might have noticed something. OK, I can change them to something else. But that's not very useful. What if I want to delete some? What if I want to add some? Like, the interfaces we're used to using on the web also allow us to do that. So you can accomplish that with an MV multiple attribute. And Mavo just adds the necessary buttons and controls to create new items, which are also editable. And I can delete items, or I can undo the deletion. I can rearrange them. And I didn't have to do anything for that besides add an HTML attribute. And these can be much more complicated than just one piece of text. For example, let's turn this into a collection like that. So notice that now I got an add cat button, which I can use. And I can actually add Tim Berners-Lee as a second item instead of having to edit my first one. And I can even include collections inside other collections. Like, let's try this here. Let's add a hobbies collection. So I haven't saved my data. That's why it returned back to just having one item. So, oh, and I haven't added MV multiple. So notice that now I have two collections. And by using MV multiple attributes inside other MV multiple elements, you can actually create very complex schemas that, with a traditional approach, would require a lot of programming, maybe a SQL database on the back end, whereas here all it takes is just designing your HTML as if it was a static website and adding a few attributes. But just by using these very simple primitives that I've shown so far, you can already create like an editable homepage or like an editable portfolio website. This is an example of a painter's portfolio. These are actually my awesome cousin's Jules paintings. I think she's great. And you can also see how image uploads work over there. It shows how you can upload an image by pasting something, by copying an image from somewhere else and pasting it, or by uploading it, or by drag and drop. This is my list of talks, which was actually the very first Mavo app ever created. This was the thing that kind of motivated me to create Mavo, because I started by copying and pasting HTML, and after like a few talks, this became very tedious. So I was like, I need to write some code to do this. So I wrote some custom JavaScript code, and it was like a few hundred lines, and I still had to edit JSON to add new talks. So I kept delaying to add new talks pretty much until I had given the talk already. It was very tedious. And now all I have to do is just click edit. This is an example of a contacts list with like image uploads. However, sometimes you don't just edit data, but you also want to display the same data somewhere else, potentially even transform it, which is what the bracket notation does. So here, notice that I'm changing the slider, and the value updates in real time. I could also do math with it. Here I've divided it by 100. And I could also use that in attributes. So how many of you were here during Chris's talk, and specifically the part about variable fonts? Raise your hands. Most of you? Excellent. So I'm going to show you how you can make a demo for variable fonts. Let's make the font bigger. Oh, not on the slider. Gosh. That's why it wasn't working. OK, excellent. This is Skia is kind of an ugly font, but it has the advantage of being a variable font that ships with OS X by default. And we can use the font variation settings syntax, which is, yes, it's awful, but it works. And notice that 3 gives us a really bold font, 2 gives us slightly less bold, and so on. So I'm going to use strength here divided by 30, because the slider goes from 0 to 100. And I'm also going to change this to 30 so I can see what value I'm actually using. So notice that now I change the slider, and it modifies the weight of the font very smoothly. Thank you. And by using the same idea, you can make a color picker. Here I've actually named my expression. These things in brackets are called expressions. So notice that here I've named my expression and I've used it somewhere else. I didn't have to copy and paste it like I did with the strength divided by 30 before. So by just using the simple syntax, I've created an Hsl color picker, fully functional Hsl color picker. And I could take it even further and style the sliders as well with like gradients that also depend on the values of the other sliders. So this is an even more full HSLA color picker. You can actually find it on the Mavo website. All of these demo videos are of actual demos from the Mavo website. This is when I was experimenting with the logo. I wanted to try different variations, so I made a Mavo that uses SVG with expressions in it so that I can explore different variations, specifically angles and thicknesses, and see how it looks in different sizes. This is a simple mortgage calculator to show how it can do things like that you're more used to using spreadsheets for. And this is kind of a silly demo, but I like how it shows that if you use so Mavo has some predefined variables that start with $, and $now is one of them, which you can pass into a function, a time function, and it converts it into a human-readable time. And you can use it everywhere you can use a Mavo expression. So let's try something. How many of you have seen this color clock that used to be floating around? Raise your hand if you've seen this. It had become a bit popular a few years ago. So let's try to make a color clock. I'm going to specify a fixed Hsl color. All right, you need a property. And let's try to see. We need an expression that goes from 0 to 360 so that the hue changes from red and cycles through all the hues we have. So let's start experimenting, first by printing out now, which you see is kind of a useless number. You can divide it by 1,000. It's actually the number of milliseconds since 1st of January, 1970. So it's kind of a useless number by itself. But if you use math on it, you can do useful things. So if we divide it by 1,000, it changes every second. Notice that the integer part of it changes every second. And you can multiply it by 6 to change twice as fast, 6 times as fast. Notice that now you get 6 different numbers per second. And we can do mod 360 to only get the remainder of this number when it's divided by 360. And look at now that now we got a number that cycles from 0 to 360, and it should go from 0 to 360 in the span of a minute. And now we could either name this and use it in our style attribute, or I can just copy it, which is easier. And if I let this running for a bit, which I probably shouldn't because I'm running out of time, but if I let this running for a bit, you can see that the color should change. You see that? It's a completely useless demo, but I love it. Silly demos are the best. And expressions become quite useful when they're combined with collections. Remember, collections are elements with MV multiple. So, for example, I can count how many cats I have here. Notice that it was first 1 as my data was loading, and now it's 5. It updates dynamically. Like, I can go here and add a cat, and now it updated to 6. Or I can count how many cats have ages, for example, because I can refer to any property anywhere in the Mavo. I don't have to think of like complicated paths and things like that. Or I can even do things like this. Count how many cats are older than 6. And you can see that now it's only 2. And if we have time, well, we can do this very, very quickly. I have a demo for you, if you have internet access. Well, the Wi-Fi seems to be working quite well. So visit this URL. Log in with your GitHub account. I'm sorry that the permissions it asks for are very broad. I can't ask for permissions just for a specific repo. GitHub doesn't let me. Make some edits to the data. Maybe change some cat's name. Maybe add your own cat if you have one. How many of you have cats? Excellent. I like cat people. So maybe make some edits. If you don't have time, you don't need to upload a photo. You can just add a cat without a photo. Save. And then click Send Edit Suggestion. Because you can also, when you save, it saves it in your own profile. So you could have your own version of this Mavo app with your own data. But you could also click Send Edit Suggestion and send a suggestion to the original, to whoever maintains the original Mavo. And that way you can have collections that like the public can update and add data, and it can be moderated. Like you can moderate what suggestions actually get added. Sadly, you can't moderate it through Mavo. You can only edit the data through Mavo and send edit suggestions, and you don't need to know anything, and you don't need to be technical for that. But currently, to actually approve the suggestions, you need to go to GitHub and look at pull requests and merge a pull request. So I'm going to do that now. Let's see if anybody has sent one yet. How many have succeeded in sending one? Raise your hand when you do, so I know to check. Yes, we have one. And I can preview the changes over here. He or she added a cat called Mistopheles. And I can squash and merge. And now, if I refresh here, it should be a part of the data. See, Mistopheles has been added. A few more demos. This is my actual invoicing system. Of course, not with that data. But because you can change the data of every Mavo through the URL, I can just go to the demo on the website, change the URL, load my actual invoicing data. That's how I issue invoices. Also, I've always found, I love hand-coding SVG, but I always found the syntax for paths very complicated. So I always wanted to write an app for this, but I was too lazy. Whereas with Mavo, I was able to do it just with HTML. And I can create paths visually like this. Of course, it's a cat. What did you expect it to be? And you can find all these demos on the website. This is another one. This is my list of recipes. Me and my partner like cooking a lot. And this is also a demo of how you can do a multi-page web app with Mavo. This is a separate page, and when you click on this, I'm not sure if you can't see it, but it's a separate URL. It's like forgasm.com/recipe/salmon teriyaki. And now it loads this part of the data, and I can edit this part of the data. And Mavo has been also made very extensible. If we just hard-coded all these things, then it wouldn't be very useful, right? If, for example, it just supported GitHub and Dropbox, and there was no other way to save data in a different service or on your own server, that wouldn't be very useful. But it's very, very extensible so that third-party developers can add features to it, add more storage backends, add more formats, all sorts of things. And so far, I've been describing basically an open source project. So what's the difference between developing an open source project and being in academia? The difference is that the contribution is not actually the code. You have to actually prove that you managed to answer the research question to some degree. So remember, the research question was, how can we make web programming easier? Or alternatively, how can we make it accessible to novices? But have we done that? We don't know until we evaluate it. So how do you evaluate it? In my field, you do a user study. So we recruited 20 participants. 13 were identified as female, 6 as male, and 1 as other. This is their median age. 13 were beginner or worse in programming. They self-identified as beginner or worse. And 7 were intermediate. And before they came, we asked them to bring in a mock-up of a contact manager application without telling them anything about Mavo. We just wanted to see how they would write the HTML if they didn't know anything about Mavo. We told them not to spend too much time on it, like maybe 10, 15 minutes. 7 actually brought one. So the general structure of the study was we would give them a tutorial on Mavo syntax first. Then we had a structured part where we would show them a finished application without showing them any of the code. And then we would give them a CSS and HTML mockup and ask them to write the Mavo, to add the Mavo required for turning it into a fully functional application. And at the end was the freestyle study where we asked them to turn their contact manager application to make it fully functional using Mavo. And the structured study, the goal of the structured study was to see, is Mavo usable? Is it learnable? Can people use it? And the freestyle study was to see if Mavo's capabilities are sufficient to actually turn the HTML that people actually write into fully functional applications. So for the structured study, these were the 2 applications we showed them, and we split the tasks into like 12 or 10 steps, ranging from basic tasks like make this part of the website editable or turn it into a collection, to basic expressions like things that required them to show the value of something somewhere else or count how many items there were and things like that. And there were also a few steps that were complex expressions, like an average of averages or a count with a filter or a conditional, whose goal was to test the limits of Mavo. Like, we knew these were going to be hard, but we wanted to push it to the limit and see how people do. So these were the 2 applications. These are also available on the demos. So you can see a theme here. So this is a decision-making application where you weigh pros and cons, and it helps you make a decision. And this is a foodie log, where you can log your visits to restaurants and what you ate and what you thought of it, and it calculates the average rating for each visit and the rating of the restaurant. So before the study, we showed them these applications without any code, and we asked them, if you were given the HTML and CSS, how long do you think it would take you? And 5 said hours, and the rest said days, weeks, or months. In practice, they did it in about half an hour. And the results were, all of them were able to carry out the basic CRUD tasks. CRUD means create, read, update, delete. So it describes tasks like editing data, adding new items, deleting, things like that. Almost all of them were able to carry out the basic expressions tasks, like showing the value of something somewhere else, counting items, averages. And one interesting thing that we noticed was actually their failures were all concentrated in cases where the variable part of an attribute or the content was not surrounded by white space. It was not visually distinct from the text that surrounded it, but it was surrounded by other kinds of punctuation. And surprisingly, that tripped up people a lot. And about 3 out of 4 were able to carry out the complex expressions tasks. which we thought was quite good, given that these were designed to push people to their limits a bit. Many people found conditionals hard. We have an if function that takes a test as its first parameter, and then prints out the second argument if that test is true, and the third if it's false. Many people found that hard, especially when it was nested. And some of them even remarked at how it reminded them what was hard about programming. So after the study, we added markup-based conditionals so that people don't have to come into contact with that for every single conditional they need. Like for simple cases where you just want to remove an element from the page if a test is false, you don't need to use that. And the perceived difficulty of creating these apps fell 2 points on a 5-point scale. And these are the details of how much it fell. Apparently, people thought the foodie logo was a much harder app to create initially, but actually it was as easy as the decisions one. And this is a summary. For the freestyle study, these are some examples of the contact manager people made. I mean, we told them to not spend more than 10 or 15 minutes, and most of them were beginner. So that explains how they look. But all of them were able to convert them to fully functional apps, which was the point of the study. And some of them even made their own apps. And my favorite is this horse feeding app. There was this participant that had her horse in a stable, and it was really complicated to track like their blankets and their feedings and all that. Apparently, it's super complicated to manage horses. And they had this table that they would erase and write on every day. And she made them this app, which I think they use. Many people remarked that Mavo was simple, it was easy to learn, but most importantly, it did the things that they were having trouble to do, which is exactly why we made it. And we published a paper about this at an academic conference called WIST. And before I finish, the thing is that Mavo doesn't yet do everything we envision for it. Like, the parts that are actually implemented are very, very tiny bit of what we actually see for it. There are many things we can't do. So we have a lot of things planned for the future. For example, you can almost do this to-do list, but you can't do the clear completed button. So having custom data interactions is something I'm really looking forward to doing. Because right now you can only edit your data via the UI that Mavo adds. And you can customize the UI, but you cannot have custom data actions. Also, granular edit access control, like being able to add items and only edit your own items. Right now you can either edit all the data or nothing. Real-time apps, like apps, for example, a chat app where the server also, the cloud service you're using also pushes data. Sorting, filtering, grouping, and searching, data exploration, things like that. Actually, we already have sorting. We have someone working on it that just finished it, and he's moving on to grouping now. So that's sort of being already done. Pivoting, let's say you have a list of restaurants with visits and foods. What if you want to change it to a list of restaurants and which contains a list of foods, and each food contains the dates that you ate it on? Or having data that is not nested, but it actually links to other data. Or even beyond the browser, like what about mobile apps or Internet of Things type of things? So there's a lot to do, and we're really excited about it. If you want to get involved, it's a free and open source project. It's on GitHub. If you actually know JavaScript, you can create plugins. You can actually work on the core. Even if you don't, you could help with documentation. So that's about it. Thank you very much. And before I say goodbye, I have stickers. Oh.
Everybody loves stickers.
I have stickers. So come and find me, if anything, either to ask questions or just to ask for a sticker. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lea. Thank you.